The man who built America's steel empire, Andrew Carnegie's ruthless dream. Imagine controlling more wealth than the U.S. government itself. In 1901, Andrew Carnegie sold his steel company to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, an astronomical figure at the time, equivalent to well over $15 billion today. He became, in effect, the richest man in the world. Yet the story of how this poor immigrant boy from Scotland rose to such power is not simply a tale of hard work and luck. It's also one of ruthless ambition, shrewd strategy, and a moral reckoning that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Carnegie's life began humbly. Born in 1835 in Dunfermline, Scotland, he grew up in a cramped one-room weaver's cottage. His father, a hand-loom weaver, lost his livelihood when machines displaced skilled workers during the Industrial Revolution. The family struggled so badly that in 1848, when Andrew was just 13, they scraped together enough to emigrate to America, settling in Pittsburgh. The boy had little schooling, but he had a sharp memory and an insatiable appetite for learning. He devoured books from a local benefactor's library, an act of generosity that later inspired his own philanthropy. At just 13, Carnegie took his first job as a bobbin boy in a textile factory, earning $1.20 a week. He later became a telegraph messenger, quickly mastering Morse code and earning a reputation for speed and accuracy. These jobs weren't glamorous, but they introduced him to men of influence, and Carnegie had a talent for charming, powerful mentors. At 18, he landed a position with the Pennsylvania Railroad under Thomas A. Scott, one of the most influential railroad executives of the era. This was Carnegie's first big break. He watched how railroads operated, how contracts were negotiated, and most importantly, how insider knowledge could make fortunes. Carnegie wasn't shy about using that knowledge. He invested early in railroad-related businesses, bridges, ironworks, even sleeping cars. By his late 20s, he was making far more money from investments than from his salary. The Civil War only accelerated his rise. While the nation bled, Carnegie secured government contract for iron and armaments, cementing his reputation as a shrewd, some might say opportunistic, businessman. But the real empire began with steel. In the 1870s, Carnegie recognized that steel would replace iron as a backbone of modern industry. It was stronger, lighter, and ideal for railroads, skyscrapers, and weapons. He traveled to Britain to study the new Bessemer process, which drastically cut the cost of producing steel. Bringing the method to America, he poured everything into building state-of-the-art steel mills. His company, Carnegie Steel, grew to dominate the market, producing more steel than all of Great Britain by the 1890s. His genius wasn't just in spotting trends, it was in execution. Carnegie believed in vertical integration, owning every stage of production from raw materials to transportation. He bought iron mines, coal fields, ships, and railroads, ensuring his company could operate independently and cheaply. He also ruthlessly cut costs, squeezing efficiency out of every worker and machine. To his rivals, he was unstoppable. To his workers, he was merciless. And here lies the darker side of Carnegie's empire. In 1892, tensions at his Homestead Steel Works boiled over. Wages were slashed, hours were long, and working conditions were brutal. When workers went on strike, Carnegie's lieutenant, Henry Clay Frick, hired Pinkerton agents to break it. The confrontation turned violent. Gunfire erupted, men were killed, and the strike collapsed under military intervention. Carnegie, conveniently vacationing in Scotland at the time, distanced himself from the bloodshed. But the Homestead strike forever stained his reputation. How could the man who preached harmony between labor and capital preside over such brutality? Despite controversies, Carnegie never stopped thinking about his legacy. By the late 1890s, he had grown weary of business battles. When J.P. Morgan offered to buy Carnegie Steel in 1901, Carnegie agreed. The sale created U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history, and made Carnegie one of the richest men alive. But instead of hoarding wealth, he embarked on an unprecedented philanthropic campaign. Carnegie believed in the gospel of wealth, the idea that the rich had a moral obligation to redistribute their fortune for the public good. Over the next 2 decades, he gave away over 90% of his wealth. He built more than 2,500 public libraries worldwide, funded universities, established Carnegie Hall in New York, and set up trusts for education and peace. He once said, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." True to his word, he spent his final years emptying his vault for causes he believed would outlast him. Yet the paradox remains. Carnegie built his empire through methods that crushed unions and exploited cheap labor, then spent his twilight years funding libraries so that working-class children could read books he himself once borrowed for free. Was this redemption or hypocrisy? Perhaps both. Looking back, Andrew Carnegie's life is a study in contradictions, a rags-to-riches immigrant who embodied the American dream, yet whose empire was stained with blood and conflict, a ruthless capitalist who became one of the greatest philanthropists in history. His story forces us to ask, do the ends justify the means? Can generosity erase the moral compromises of ambition? What we can say for certain is that Carnegie's legacy still shapes the world. Every time someone steps into a Carnegie library, attends a concert at Carnegie Hall, or studies at an institution his wealth created, they are touched by the life of a man who rose from poverty to unimaginable power. His empire of steel may have faded, but his empire of ideas endures. And maybe that was his plan all along, not just to build steel that held up cities, but to build a legacy that held up time itself. If you enjoyed this story, leave a money bag in the comments.